A police officer suspects that a woman is an accomplice in a series of thefts in the neighborhood and takes her to the station. However, after talking to her, he realizes it was all a misunderstanding and that she was actually helping the victims. Intrigued by her kindness, he decides to get to know her better. The day at the Portland police station began like any other for Detective Marcus Romano. Piles of reports were piling up on his desk while he watched the fine rain falling on the city through the window. That's when Officer Brian Patterson burst through the door, leading a woman in her mid-30s, brown hair tied up in a messy bun and green eyes that conveyed a peculiar mixture of serenity and concern. "Detective Romano, we found this suspect near the Hendersons' residence, where the theft took place last week," Patterson said, keeping a firm grip on the woman's arm. She was acting suspiciously, watching other houses in the neighborhood. Marcus rose from his chair, carefully studying the woman in front of him. Unlike most of the suspects who passed through that room, she maintained a calm and dignified posture without showing the typical nervousness of someone who has something to hide. "What's your name?" asked Marcus, indicating the chair in front of her desk. "Grace Mitchell," she replied, sitting down gracefully. "And I can explain exactly what I was doing in that neighborhood." Patterson stood by the door as Marcus settled into his chair. Years of experience as a detective had taught him to read people, and something about Grace didn't fit the common profile of criminals. "I'm listening, Ms. Mitchell," said Marcus, picking up his notepad. Grace settled into her chair and began. "I'm a volunteer social worker. Over the last few weeks, I've noticed a pattern in the thefts in this area. All the victims are elderly people who live alone. I've started visiting the neighborhood to check on other vulnerable seniors and warn them about the risks." Marcus frowned, interested. "And why didn't you go to the police with this information?" "I tried," she replied, a slight tone of frustration in her voice. "I called the police station 3 times last week, but was told there wasn't enough evidence to establish a pattern." The detective quickly flicked through some reports on his desk. In fact, he found call records for a Grace Mitchell, all cataloged as non-priority information. "Ms. Mitchell, can you show me some identification from your volunteer work?" She opened her purse, which Patterson had searched earlier, and took out a card from the Portland Welfare Association, along with documents proving her volunteer work in various social projects in the city. As he examined the documents, Marcus felt a pang of guilt at the way the department had ignored Grace's attempts to help. "Patterson, would you excuse us?" The officer nodded and left the room, closing the door behind him. "Tell me more about your observations," Marcus asked, now genuinely interested. Over the next hour, Grace described her findings in detail. She had mapped the thefts, identified patterns in the times and methods used, and even started implementing preventative measures with the elderly in the area. "I installed security cameras in Mrs. Anderson's house yesterday," Grace explained. "She's 78 and has lived alone since her husband passed away. I got the cameras through donations from the community." Marcus leaned back in his chair, impressed. What had initially seemed like a case of suspicious behavior had turned into something completely different. Grace wasn't just innocent. She was doing the job that the police themselves should be doing. "Why do you care so much?" he asked, genuinely curious. Grace was silent for a moment, her green eyes focusing on a distant point. "My grandmother was the victim of a scam a few years ago. She lost all her savings. After that, I promised myself that I would do my best to protect other elderly people from similar situations." The vulnerability in his voice touched something in Marcus. 15 years into his police career, he had become somewhat cynical, but something in Grace's sincerity reminded him why he had chosen this profession in the first place. "Miss Mitchell, I'd like to apologize for today's inconvenience," he said, standing up. "In fact, I think we could work together on this case. Your observations are valuable, and with the official support of the department, we could expand your prevention work." Grace's face lit up at the suggestion. "That would be wonderful, Detective. I have more information at home, including a detailed map of the incidents and possible future targets." "Marcus," he corrected, holding out his hand. "You can call me Marcus." Grace smiled, accepting the handshake. The brief contact sent an unexpected current of electricity through Marcus' arm, taking him by surprise. "Can I bring my files tomorrow?" she asked, standing up. Of course, he replied, trying to maintain a professional tone despite his sudden awareness of how much her smile affected him. Can we meet here at 9? Grace nodded, gathering her things. As she left the room, Marcus remained standing, watching her silhouette disappear down the corridor. What had started out as another monotonous day had turned into the beginning of something he still couldn't fully define. Returning to his desk, Marcus opened a new file on his computer. As he typed in the preliminary information on the case, he couldn't help but notice how his perspective on the investigation had changed completely in just a few hours. And perhaps it wasn't just the investigation that was changing. The next morning, Marcus arrived at the police station earlier than usual. As he set up his desk for his meeting with Grace, he found himself anxious in a way he hadn't been for years. The coffee in his favorite cup, already halfway down, was stronger than usual, an unconscious attempt to calm his nerves. At 8:45, Grace appeared at her office door, carrying an expanded briefcase and a laptop. Her hair was loose today, falling in soft waves over her shoulders, and she was wearing a navy blue blouse that brought out the green of her eyes even more. "Good morning, Marcus," she greeted with a warm smile. "I hope I'm not too early." "Not at all," he replied, getting up to help her with the materials. "In fact, I'm impressed by your organization." Grace began to lay out her documents on the table, revealing meticulous research work. There were detailed maps of the region, marked with different colors indicating the types of occurrences, dates of the thefts, and profiles of the victims. There was also a complete spreadsheet with information on vulnerable, elderly people in the area. "This is impressive," commented Marcus, examining the documents. "You did all this research yourself?" "Yes," she replied, opening her laptop. "I developed a classification system based on the patterns I observed. For example, the red dots are completed burglaries, the yellow dots are failed attempts, and the blue dots are homes I've identified as potential future targets." Marcus leaned over the table, studying the map. "I noticed there's a higher concentration of incidents in this area." He pointed to a set of markings. "Exactly," Grace perked up. "And it's no coincidence. All these streets have characteristics in common: poor street lighting, older houses with obsolete security systems, and a predominantly elderly population." As Grace explained her findings, Marcus couldn't help but notice how she changed as she talked about her work. Her eyes shone with intensity, and her hands moved gracefully as she illustrated her points. It was clear that this was more than a project for her. It was a mission. "Grace," he interrupted softly, "why didn't you become a police officer? You have a natural talent for investigation." She paused for a moment, a slight blush tinging her cheeks. "Actually, I've thought about it, but I realized that I could help more people by working directly with the community. As a social worker, I can build relationships of trust that would be more difficult with a badge." Marcus nodded, understanding perfectly. In his years of service, he had often encountered resistance from people, even when he tried to help them. "Besides," she continued, "after what happened to my grandmother, I understood that prevention is just as important as investigation." "Tell me more about your grandmother," Marcus asked, noticing a shadow of sadness pass across Grace's face. She took a deep breath before beginning. "Catherine was a retired teacher. She lived alone after my grandfather died. One day, she received a call from someone impersonating me, saying that I was in trouble and needed money urgently." Marcus closed his eyes, already familiar with this type of scam. The family member in trouble scam. "Yes," Grace confirmed, her voice breaking. "She withdrew all her savings, $15,000. When I found out, it was too late. The worst thing wasn't even the loss of the money, but seeing how it destroyed her emotionally. She never forgave herself for having fallen for the scam. And where is she now?" "She passed away 2 years ago," Grace replied, discreetly wiping away a tear. "But before she left, she made me promise to help other people not to go through the same thing." Marcus reached out instinctively, lightly touching Grace's fingers on the table. The contact, though brief, sent an electric current through his arm. "You're honoring that promise magnificently." Their gazes met for a moment, charged with an intensity that neither of them had expected. Grace was the first to turn away, returning her attention to the documents. "I have a theory about the recent thefts," she said, her voice regaining its professional tone. I think we're dealing with an organized gang that specializes in the elderly. They probably have an informant in the area, someone who knows the community well. Marcus picked up his notepad. What makes you think that? The targets are very specific. They know exactly which elderly people live alone, their schedules, and even which ones have hearing or sight problems that would make them easier targets. That would explain the efficiency of the crimes, agreed Marcus. No sign of a break-in, no witnesses. Exactly, said Grace, opening another map on her laptop. And look at this. I've marked the times of all the thefts. They always occur between 2 p.m. and 4 p.m., just when most of the neighbors are at work. Marcus felt that familiar rush of excitement he always experienced when a case started to make sense. But this time, there was something else, a different connection that went beyond the investigation. Grace, he said, making a sudden decision, would you like to work with us officially on this case? As a civil consultant, your perspective and knowledge of the community would be invaluable. Her face lit up. Really? That would be incredible. But wouldn't it get in the way of my work as a social worker? Actually, I think the two jobs would complement each other perfectly, and we could set up a broader prevention program using your experience as a model. Grace smiled, a smile that made Marcus' heart race inexplicably. So, partners? Partners, he confirmed, returning the smile. As they continued to review documents and strategize, Marcus realized that that morning had changed something fundamental in his professional and perhaps personal life. Grace Mitchell was not only a valuable contributor to the case, she was, without realizing it, redesigning his view of police work and human connections. The rest of the morning passed quickly, between data analysis and planning. When Grace finally said goodbye, promising to return the next day, Marcus remained in his office, contemplating the maps and notes she had left. He realized that he was looking forward to the next meeting, and not just to progress in the investigation. In the week following their partnership, Marcus and Grace developed a work routine that mixed traditional research with a community approach. Mornings were dedicated to data analysis at the police station, while afternoons were reserved for visits to the elderly in the neighborhood, a strategy that was proving surprisingly effective. On a particularly sunny Wednesday, they found themselves at the home of Mrs. Eleanor Thompson, a 75-year-old widow who lived alone in a well-kept Victorian house. Grace had identified the residence as a potential future target due to its isolated location in the fact that Eleanor had a predictable routine. The problem is that I never know who's actually ringing the doorbell, Eleanor explained, pouring tea into antique china cups. After Harold passed away, all sorts of people started turning up offering services. Marcus watched as Grace interacted with the elderly woman. There was a naturalness to her way of conducting conversation that made people open up completely. She had a gift that no amount of police training could teach. Would you mind if we installed a camera system? Grace asked gently. It would be discreet and connected directly to the police station. Eleanor hesitated, her hands trembling slightly as she gripped her cup. I don't know. Wouldn't that be very expensive? It's a free police program, Marcus interjected, exchanging a complicit glance with Grace. In fact, he had managed to approve a special budget for the project after presenting the preliminary results of the partnership with Grace. While they were discussing the details of the installation, Marcus noticed something interesting through the living room window. A middle-aged man was standing on the sidewalk, apparently making notes on a tablet. "Excuse me," he said, getting up. "I'm going to check something outside." Grace immediately noticed the change in his posture and continued her conversation with Eleanor, keeping her distracted while Marcus left. The man on the sidewalk didn't seem to notice the detective approaching, concentrating on his tablet. He was wearing a blue uniform with the logo of a security company. "Good afternoon," Marcus greeted, his voice professional. "Can I help you?" The man startled slightly. Good afternoon. I'm just surveying the area for our company. We offer home security systems." Marcus noticed that he was avoiding direct eye contact. "Can I see your ID?" Sure, replied the man, searching his pockets. "It must be, oops, I think I forgot it in the car. I'll get it." Before Marcus could say anything else, the man walked quickly away, turning the corner. The detective memorized his appearance. About 5 feet 10 inches, gray hair, a small scar near his left eye. Going back inside, He found Grace finishing installing the security app on Eleanor's cell phone. She immediately realized that something had happened by the look on her face. "Mrs. Thompson," said Grace, "could you show us your garden? I hear your roses are prized." The old woman smiled proudly. "Oh, yes. Come and see." As Eleanor led them through the back garden, Grace discreetly approached Marcus. "What happened?" In a low voice, he recounted his encounter with the suspicious man. "It may be a coincidence, but there are no coincidences in this case," Grace added. "Remember what we found out about the burglary at the Hendersons' house? There were also reports of an alleged security systems salesman a few days earlier." Marcus nodded, the pieces beginning to fall into place. "They do reconnaissance disguised as service providers, and they get valuable information about routines, existing security systems and, most importantly, who lives alone," Grace added. After saying goodbye to Eleanor, with promises to return to check on the cameras that would be installed the next day, Marcus and Grace walked to his car. "I need to show you something," said Grace, opening her laptop as soon as they entered the vehicle. "I've been cross-referencing data from the last few months, and I've noticed a pattern in the shell companies used by the scammers." She showed a series of documents and business records. They all have something in common. They were registered using variations of the same address in different cities. It's as if they were using a template, changing only minor details. Marcus studied the documents, impressed once again by Grace's investigative skills. "That's brilliant. How did you get these records?" "Let's just say I have some contacts in the Commerce Department," she replied with an enigmatic smile. "Sometimes being a social worker opens interesting doors." The afternoon sun streamed in through the car windows, creating a golden glow in Grace's hair. Marcus realized that he had been watching her for longer than was professionally appropriate, and forced himself to turn his attention back to the documents. "I think it's time we expanded our investigation," he said. "I can request warrants to investigate these addresses. And I can alert my network of social workers in other cities," Grace added. "If we're right, this could be bigger than we imagined." Before Marcus could reply, his phone rang. It was Officer Patterson. "Detective, we've just received a report. An elderly woman was the victim of a burglary about an hour ago. The address is 1542 Maple Street." Marcus and Grace exchanged worried glances. It was only 3 blocks from where they were standing. "We're on our way," Marcus replied, starting the car. As they drove to the location, Grace quickly reviewed her notes. "Marcus, that street was marked on my map as a risk area. We should have started there." He noticed the guilt in her voice. "Hey, we can't be everywhere. We're doing the best we can." Grace nodded, but Marcus could see that she was shaken. Instinctively, he reached out and touched hers briefly. "We're going to get these guys," he said with determination. "And thanks to your work, we're closer than ever." The touch and the words seemed to calm Grace down. When they arrived at the crime scene, they were both focused and ready for another step in the investigation. What they didn't know was that this new theft would bring revelations that would completely change the course of the case and their lives. The scene of the new theft on Maple Street turned out to be even more disturbing than Marcus and Grace had expected. The victim, 82-year-old Dorothy Walsh, was visibly shaken, sitting in her favorite armchair as she recounted the events to Officer Patterson. "He seemed so nice," Dorothy said, her hands shaking as she held a glass of water. "He said he was from the gas company, showed a badge and everything. While he was checking the meter at the back of the house, another man must have come in through the front." Grace sat down next to the elderly woman, holding her hands gently. Marcus observed how she had a natural gift for comforting victims, something that he, even with years of police experience, still found challenging. "Ms. Walsh," Marcus asked gently, "can you describe the man who introduced himself as an employee of the gas company?" "Tall, gray-haired," replied Dorothy, frowning in concentration. "Oh, and he had a peculiar mark near his left eye, like a scar." Marcus and Grace exchanged meaningful glances. It was the same description of the man they had met earlier in front of Eleanor Thompson's house. "How much did they take, Dorothy?" asked Grace softly. "All my jewelry," replied the elderly woman, her voice breaking. "Even the engagement ring that belonged to my mother. 50 years of memories." While Grace continued to console Dorothy, Marcus conducted a thorough inspection of the house with the forensics team. In the master bedroom, they found partial fingerprints on the dresser and tool marks on the lock of the back window. Detective Romano called out one of the technicians. "We found this lying behind the dresser." It was a crumpled business card from a security company called Guardian Solutions. Marcus photographed the card and immediately sent it for analysis. Returning to the living room, he found Grace finalizing the police report on her tablet. "We need to talk," he said quietly. Grace nodded, understanding the urgency in his tone. After making sure Dorothy would be okay, a niece was on her way to spend the night with her. Marcus and Grace headed to a nearby coffee shop. The place was almost empty at that time of the afternoon, allowing for a private conversation. "It's the same man," said Marcus as soon as they sat down. "It can't be a coincidence." Grace opened her laptop, quickly accessing her files. "Look at this," she said, turning the screen to Marcus. In the last 3 months, 6 new security companies had been registered in Portland and neighboring cities, all with a similar corporate structure and no previous business history. Front companies, Marcus concluded, used for target reconnaissance. Exactly. What's more, I cross-checked the data of the registered employees. Some names appear in more than one company, but with different documents. Marcus leaned over the table, studying the information. Fake identities. They're more organized than we thought. "Marcus," Grace said hesitantly, "I think I know someone who can help us, but it's not exactly an official contact." He raised an eyebrow, puzzled. "What kind of contact?" "An ex-striker," she replied, lowering her voice. "He works with me now, helping to identify schemes targeting the elderly. He knows the methods, the networks." Marcus thought for a moment. As a police officer, he should be wary of unofficial sources. But something about Grace made him trust her judgment. "Are you sure we can trust him?" "Absolutely," Grace replied with conviction. "Ray has turned his life around. He helps a lot of people now, especially after his own mother was the victim of a similar scam." "Right," agreed Marcus after a pause. "But let's keep this quiet for now. When can we meet him?" "I can arrange it for tonight," said Grace, already typing a message into her cell phone. "He prefers to meet after dark, for obvious reasons." While they waited for a reply, Marcus watched Grace. There was something fascinating about how she moved between different worlds, the formal police world, the community welfare world, and now this underworld of retired informants. The cell phone vibrated. "Ray can meet us at 9 in Riverside Park," Grace informed her. "A park at night?" asked Marcus, his police instinct alerting him. Grace smiled. "Trust me, Ray has his reasons, and the place is safer than it looks." As they left the cafe, the sun was beginning to set, painting the Portland sky in shades of orange and pink. Marcus suggested having something to eat before the meeting, and Grace accepted. They chose a small Italian restaurant near the park. Over dinner, the conversation flowed naturally beyond the case. Grace talked about her work with support groups for the elderly, and Marcus shared stories of his early years in the police force. There was an ease in being together that neither of them expected, a connection that went beyond professional partnership. "Why did you choose to be a policeman?" asked Grace, toying with the last ravioli on her plate. Marcus hesitated. He rarely shared this story. "My father was a letter carrier," he began. "He knew everyone in the neighborhood, especially the elderly. One day, he witnessed an attempted robbery of a lady. He intervened, stopped the crime, but," he paused, taking a deep breath. "The scammer came back later, with friends. My father spent 3 months in hospital." Grace reached across the table, lightly touching his fingers. "I'm sorry." "He recovered," Marcus continued, aware of the warmth of her touch. "But it changed something in me. I realized I wanted to do more than just witness injustices." The moment was interrupted by Grace's cell phone. It was another message from Ray, confirming the exact location of the meeting. "Are you ready?" she asked, putting her phone away. Marcus nodded, quickly paying the bill. As they walked towards the park, he realized that he was nervous, not about meeting the informant, but about his growing awareness of his feelings for Grace. It was a complication he hadn't anticipated, but which, surprisingly, he didn't want to avoid. The park awaited them, steeped in shadows and mysteries, promising revelations that could change not only the course of the investigation, but also their future. Riverside Park at night had a completely different atmosphere from its daytime appearance. The streetlights created elongated shadows between the trees, and the distant sound of the river mixed with the urban noise of the city. Marcus and Grace walked along a paved path, their footsteps echoing softly in the relative silence of the park. "Is Ray always here?" asked Marcus, his watchful eyes constantly scanning their surroundings. "He prefers open places," explained Grace. "He says it's harder to be ambushed that way. Old habits, I suppose." They arrived at a set of benches next to a small artificial lake. A solitary figure was already waiting for them, wearing a dark coat and a low cap that partially concealed his face. "Grace," the man greeted, standing up. His voice was surprisingly soft for someone of his robust stature. "And you must be Detective Romano." "Ray," Grace smiled, hugging him briefly. "Thank you for finding us at such short notice." Marcus watched the interaction with interest. Ray appeared to be in his 50s, with deep wrinkles around his eyes that suggested an intense life. His hands, when he greeted Marcus, were calloused and strong. "So," Ray began, sitting down again, "Grace told me about the thefts. It seems that some old acquaintances are back in business." "Old acquaintances?" asked Marcus, taking a seat next to Grace. Ray took a deep breath, looking out over the lake. "About 15 years ago, there was a group that specialized in scams against the elderly in the northeast of the country. They were extremely organized, professional. They used front companies, false documents, the whole scheme." "What happened to them?" asked Grace. "Most of them were arrested in 2008, but some managed to escape. The leader, a guy called Victor Crane, was never found." Ray paused, adjusting his cap. "The mode of operation you described is his trademark." Marcus leaned forward, interested. "Why have I never heard of this case?" "Because it doesn't officially exist," Ray replied. "Crane had powerful connections, people who ensured that certain investigations were quietly shelved." Grace exchanged a worried glance with Marcus. "So we're dealing with something much bigger than we imagined?" "Much bigger," Ray confirmed. "And if Crane really is behind it, you need to be careful. He doesn't like people interfering in his business." "Can you give us more information about how he operates?" asked Marcus. Ray looked around before continuing, a habit that apparently never left him. "Crane always works in independent cells. Each group has its own area of operation, but they all follow the same pattern. First, they identify areas with a high concentration of elderly people. Then they set up legitimate front companies, security, utilities, anything that gives access to the houses. Like the companies we found," Grace muttered. "Exactly. The trick is that they actually provide some legitimate services to establish credibility. But the real aim is to map potential targets." Marcus made mental notes, starting to see the bigger picture. "And the companies are discarded after a few months." "Precisely," nodded Ray. "When suspicions start to arise, the company closes down, and another one takes its place. It's a continuous cycle." "How can we trace it?" asked Grace. Ray hesitated for a moment. "There is someone who can help. A former accountant who worked for Crane. She keeps a low profile now, but still has access to certain information." "Can we trust her?" asked Marcus. "Diana can be trusted," Ray assured him. "She left the organization when she realized they were targeting the elderly. She has her own demons to atone for." Grace lightly touched Marcus' arm. "I think we should give it a try. It's our best lead so far." Marcus nodded, though still with reservations. "How can we find her?" "I'll arrange a meeting," said Ray, standing up. "But remember, absolute discretion. If Crane finds out you're investigating, we understand," interrupted Grace. "And Ray, thank you." The man smiled slightly. "You helped me when I needed it, Grace. I'm just returning the favor." After Ray left, Marcus and Grace sat there, processing the information. The night had cooled, and Grace shivered slightly. Without thinking, Marcus took off his coat and draped it over her shoulders. "Thank you," she murmured, surprised by the gesture. "Grace," Marcus began, his voice serious. "This case is getting dangerous. Maybe you should—" "Don't even finish that sentence," she interrupted, her green eyes shining with determination. I'm not going to abandon these people. Not now. Marcus smiled, recognizing the same obstinacy that attracted him more and more to Grace. Then we'll do it together. But we need to be more careful. I agree, she said, standing up. Tomorrow we can start mapping all the security companies registered in the last 6 months. Look for patterns, connections, and wait for Ray's contact about Diana, Marcus added. As they walked back to the parking lot, Marcus realized that they were entering dangerous territory, not only in relation to the case, but also in his feelings for Grace. The concern he felt for her safety went beyond the professional, and it scared him more than any criminal he had ever faced. Grace must have sensed his unease. Is everything all right? Yes, he replied, forcing a smile. Just thinking about the case. But when they reached the car and Grace returned his coat, the brief touch of their hands sent that now familiar electric current through his body, reminding him that some battles cannot be won, especially those fought within one's own heart. The week following the meeting with Ray was marked by an intense investigation. Marcus and Grace set up a temporary base in the police station's meeting room, where maps, documents, and photos covered the walls. The aroma of strong coffee was permanent, fueling the long hours of work. I found 3 more companies with the same pattern, said Grace, circling dots on a digital map. All registered in the last 4 months, all with addresses that don't exist. Marcus moved closer, observing the pattern that emerged. And all within a 50-kilometer radius of Portland. Crane is expanding his operation methodically. At that moment, Officer Patterson entered the room. Detective Romano, do you have a moment? Marcus followed Patterson into the hallway, where the young officer looked uncomfortable. What is it? I got an anonymous call, Patterson said quietly. Someone is asking questions about you and Miss Mitchell in the neighborhood, wanting to know about the investigation. An alarm went off in Marcus' mind. Ray had warned them about this. Crane didn't like interference in his business. Returning to the living room, he found Grace engrossed in her laptop. The light from the screen illuminated her concentrated face, and for a moment Marcus felt a wave of concern that went beyond the professional. Grace, he called softly, we need to talk. He reported Patterson's information, watching as her expression subtly changed. There was no fear in her eyes, just a more intense determination. I'm not backing down, Marcus, she said before he could even suggest it. These people need our help. I know, he replied, taking a seat next to her. But we need to be more cautious. From now on, you're not going anywhere on your own. Grace started to protest, but was interrupted by the sound of her cell phone. It was a message from Ray. Diana has agreed to meet you. Tonight, same conditions. Marcus and Grace exchanged glances. It was an opportunity they couldn't afford to miss, even with the growing risks. I'll prepare a discreet support team, said Marcus. No, interrupted Grace. Ray was specific about total discretion. If Diana notices any police presence, she'll disappear. Marcus ran a hand through his hair in frustration. Grace, it's too risky. Trust me, she said, lightly touching his arm. The contact sent that familiar electric current through his body. Trust Ray. The next few hours were dedicated to careful preparations. Marcus insisted that Grace use a discreet tracker, and she agreed, understanding his concern. They also memorized escape routes and established simple codes for emergencies. At 8 in the evening, they left the police station separately so as not to attract attention. The meeting point was an old industrial cafe converted into an art space in the historic district. The place was busy enough to guarantee anonymity, but not so crowded as to make observation difficult. Grace arrived first, choosing a table on the mezzanine level that offered good visibility. Marcus entered 10 minutes later, taking a seat at a table on the first floor with a clear view of her. The plan was for him to go upstairs only when Diana arrived, so as not to frighten her. At 8:30 sharp, a woman in her 40s with short gray hair and thin-rimmed glasses came up to the mezzanine. Her gait was resolute, but her eyes moved constantly, scanning her surroundings. She headed straight for Grace's desk. Marcus observed the initial interaction, his hands tense around the cup of coffee he hadn't touched. After a few minutes, Grace made a discreet signal, and he went up to join them. Diana worked as an accountant for Crane for 5 years, Grace explained when Marcus sat down. She has access to records that can help us trace the money. Diana nervously adjusted her glasses. You have no idea how big his operation is. It's not just thefts, it's a whole network of money laundering, false documents, political connections. Why are you helping us? Asked Marcus directly. Diana hesitated, her hands trembling slightly. My father, he was one of the victims. I didn't know at first that the targets were elderly people. When I found out, she took a deep breath. I tried to leave, but Crane won't let anyone just leave. How did you do it? Asked Grace softly. I made a deal with a federal prosecutor. Testimony in exchange for protection, but Crane has long arms. I had to disappear completely. Marcus leaned forward. And why risk showing up now? Because you're different, replied Diana, looking directly at Grace. Ray told me about your work with the elderly. And you, Detective Romano, have a reputation for integrity that is rare. She pulled a USB stick out of her bag. Here's everything I have. Financial records, names of front companies, political connections. But, she hesitated before handing it over. If you use this, he'll come after you. Grace took the flash drive without hesitation. We're already prepared for that. No, said Diana, her voice shaking. You're not. Crane doesn't just destroy people. He destroys everything they love first. A heavy silence fell over the table. Marcus looked at Grace, feeling that familiar tightness in his chest at the thought of the risks she was taking. I have to go, Diana said abruptly, getting up. Change your routines, check your cars every morning. Don't trust anyone new who comes into your lives. Before they could reply, she went downstairs and disappeared into the cafe crowd. Marcus and Grace remained seated, the USB stick between them on the table like a time bomb. We don't have to do this, Marcus said softly. We can pass the information on to the feds. Let them… Marcus, Grace interrupted, her green eyes fixed on his. Do you really think we could turn back now? He knew better. It wasn't just about the case anymore. It was about them, about who they were and what they believed. Then let's do this, right? He said, picking up the flash drive. Together. Grace smiled, that smile that always made his heart race. Together. They left the cafe separately as they had arrived. But they both knew that something fundamental had changed. The threat they faced was greater than they had imagined, but so was the certainty that they could not face it alone. The days following the meeting with Diana were intense. Marcus and Grace turned his apartment into a makeshift operations center, considering the police station too exposed after the alerts about people asking questions. The place was cluttered with documents, laptops, and boards full of connections made from the information on the USB stick. Look at this, said Grace, pointing at her screen. It was almost midnight, and they were surrounded by empty coffee cups and packages of Chinese food. All front companies have a pattern in their accounting records. Regular small transfers to a consulting firm in Delaware. Marcus moved closer, leaning over her shoulder. Grace's soft perfume distracted him momentarily before he focused on the numbers. It's sophisticated, figures low enough not to attract attention, but consistent. And look at the date the consultancy was founded, Grace continued. 2 weeks before the first theft in Portland. We need a warrant to investigate this company, said Marcus, picking up his phone. He stopped when he noticed Grace's hesitant expression. What? Marcus, what if we have infiltrators in the police? Diana mentioned political connections. We can't trust anyone until we know the extent of Crane's network. He knew she was right, but the idea of not being able to trust his own colleagues disturbed him deeply. 15 years of a career built on trust and loyalty, now tainted by the shadow of suspicion. I have an idea, Grace said after a moment's silence. Remember my friend Ray? He knows someone at the FBI, someone trustworthy who works with financial crimes. Grace, Marcus began, worried. I know it's risky, she interrupted, getting up and starting to walk around the room, but we need official help at some point. We can't take down an organization of this size on our own. Marcus watched Grace as she walked, noticing how the city light coming through the window created dancing shadows on her face. Her determination fascinated and frightened him in equal measure. Okay, he finally agreed, but let's do this very carefully. No face-to-face meetings yet. Grace smiled, that smile that always made something inside him stir. Ray can arrange a secure video conference. Tomorrow night. Just then, Grace's cell phone rang. It was an unknown number. "Hello?" she answered, putting it on speakerphone. "Grace Mitchell?" An electronically distorted voice sounded through the handset. "I have a message from Victor Crane." Marcus immediately began tracing the call on his laptop, while Grace kept the conversation going. "I'm listening," she said, her voice steady despite the visible tension in her shoulders. "Mr. Crane admires your work with the elderly. It would be a shame if anything happened to them because of you. Especially to Mrs. Eleanor Thompson. She has such a beautiful garden." Grace paled. Eleanor was the elderly woman they had visited a few days ago, for whom they had installed security cameras. "If you or anyone else touches her," Grace began, but was interrupted by a metallic laugh. "It's your choice, Ms. Mitchell. Abandon the investigation, and all your protégés will remain safe. Go on." And well, accidents happen to old people every day. The line went silent. "Did you manage to trace it?" asked Grace, her hands shaking slightly. Marcus shook his head. Signal bounced off several servers. "Very sophisticated." Grace sank onto the sofa, the weight of the threat clearly visible in her posture. Marcus sat down next to her, taking her hands between his. "Hey, let's protect them," he said softly. "All of them." "How?" asked Grace, her green eyes shining with restrained tears. "We can't be everywhere at once." Marcus thought for a moment. "Maybe we don't need to be. What did you say about your network of social workers?" Grace raised her head, beginning to understand. "We can activate them. Set up a community surveillance system." "Exactly," Marcus agreed. "And I have some trusted officers who can help discreetly. Patterson, for example." "But what if Crane finds out?" "That's why we're going to be clever," said Marcus, getting up to grab his laptop. "Let's make it look like a normal community protection initiative. Nothing to arouse suspicion." They worked for the rest of the night, drawing up a protection plan that looked, on the surface, like just another safety program for the elderly. But between the lines was a sophisticated network of surveillance and protection. As the sun began to rise, Grace finally gave in to tiredness and fell asleep on the sofa. Marcus covered her with a blanket, allowing himself a moment to observe her. The vulnerability on her sleeping face contrasted with the strength she showed awake. His phone vibrated, a message from Ray confirming the video conference with the FBI contact for that evening. Marcus looked at Grace again, knowing that they were about to cross a line of no return. Crane's threat had made everything more personal and dangerous. But watching Grace sleep peacefully on her sofa, Marcus realized that he had already crossed his own line of no return, the one that separated the professional from the personal, duty from love. And this realization, curiously, no longer frightened him. On the contrary, it gave him even more determination to protect not only the threatened elderly, but also the extraordinary woman who had come into his life and changed everything. The morning sun continued to rise over Portland, promising another day of challenges and revelations. But for the first time since the case began, Marcus felt that they had a real chance of winning, not because they were stronger than Crane, but because they had something to fight for that was greater than fear. The video conference with FBI agent Robert Shun turned out to be more productive than Marcus and Grace had expected. Through a secure connection established by Ray, the agent confirmed his suspicions about the extent of Crane's operation. "We're tracking similar activities in 5 different states," Chin explained, his image slightly grainy on the laptop screen. "But Crane is slippery. Every time we get close, he disappears, leaving only empty companies and forged documents." "What about political connections?" asked Marcus, aware of Grace's worried gaze beside him. "We have evidence of the involvement of at least 2 city councilors and a retired judge in Portland," Chin replied. "But nothing concrete enough for formal charges." Grace leaned forward, her hand unconsciously reaching for Marcus's under the table. "Can the information Diana gave us help?" "Significantly," confirmed Chen. "Especially the company records in Delaware. We already have a team analyzing." The transmission was abruptly interrupted. The screen went black for a moment before displaying a message. "You have been warned." Marcus immediately disconnected his laptop from the network. "We need to get out of here. Now." He had barely finished his sentence when the sound of breaking glass echoed through the apartment. A small metal canister rolled across the floor, releasing thick, acrid smoke. "Smoke grenade!" shouted Marcus, pulling Grace towards the back door. "Stay low." They descended the emergency stairs amid the din of alarms going off and neighbors shouting. Marcus could hear heavy footsteps above them, but the providential smoke covered them. "My car is 2 blocks away," Grace whispered when they reached the alley. "I left it strategically far away, as you suggested." Marcus smiled despite the situation. Grace was becoming a remarkable strategist. "Let's split up. I'll meet you at Point B in an hour." Point B was an old warehouse converted into a community center where Grace often did volunteer work. They had set up several emergency meeting points after Crane's threat. "Marcus," Grace held his arm before they separated. "Be careful," he nodded, resisting the urge to kiss her. It wasn't the time, although his heart protested against this rational decision. An hour later, Marcus entered the community center through the back entrance, making sure he wasn't followed. Grace was already waiting for him in the old archive room, surrounded by dusty boxes. "I managed to save the flash drive," she said, showing him the device. "And I backed everything up on a secure server before the video conference." "Always one step ahead," commented Marcus, allowing himself a moment of admiration. "But now Crane knows exactly what we have." "And we know he's nervous," Grace added. "People like him don't react like that unless they feel truly threatened." Marcus began pacing the room, processing the events. "The attack on my apartment was a warning. He wants to scare us, but not eliminate us. Not yet." "Because he knows we have insurance," Grace agreed. "Diana's information. We need to use this to our advantage," said Marcus, stopping in front of a high window overlooking the river. "Make Crane think we have more than we really do." Grace approached him, her presence bringing a calm he didn't know he needed. "I have an idea, but you're not going to like it." Marcus turned to face her, noticing the determination in her green eyes. "Surprise me? What if we use the old people's network as bait?" she suggested. "Not really putting them at risk, but making Crane think we're expanding our protection operation to other cities." "Absolutely not," Marcus replied immediately. "It's too dangerous." "Think about it," Grace insisted. "If he believes we're mobilizing a larger protection network, they'll need to pull back his operations. And while he's distracted by that, we can track his actual movements," added Marcus, beginning to see the merit in the plan. "But how do we guarantee the safety of the elderly?" "We already have our community surveillance network established," Grace explained. "We can use that as cover for a larger operation, make it look like we're expanding, when in fact we're just creating a smokescreen." Marcus watched Grace as she detailed the plan. Every day he became more impressed with her unique combination of compassion and strategic cunning. "There's one more thing," she said, hesitating slightly. "I think I know who Crane's informant is in the neighborhood." Marcus raised his eyebrows in surprise. "How?" "Remember the pattern of suspicious visits before the thefts? They always started after the letter carrier had gone by. At first I thought it was a coincidence, but the letter carrier has access to information about all the residents," Marcus added, the pieces falling into place. "Delivery times, who lives alone, who receives mail regularly." "Exactly," confirmed Grace. "And guess who was transferred to our area exactly 2 weeks before the first theft?" Marcus picked up his phone, typing quickly. "I'll ask Patterson to discreetly pull up this letter carrier's history. If you're right, we can use that too," said Grace. "Feed him false information, make Crane think we're focusing in one direction while we're actually, we attack from the other side," Marcus concluded, a plan beginning to form in his mind. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the archive room. Grace moved closer to the window, watching the river that flowed silently outside. "This will work," she said softly, more to herself than to Marcus. He moved closer, gently placing a hand on her shoulder. "It will work because we're in this together." Grace turned to face him, and for a moment the world seemed to stop. The closeness between them was electric, charged with all the unspoken words and pent-up feelings of the last few weeks. "Marcus," she began, but was interrupted by the sound of his phone. It was Patterson, with preliminary information about the letter carrier. The moment passed, but something had changed. An invisible line had been crossed, and they both knew that when it was over, they would have to face what was growing between them. For now, however, they had a plan to execute and a criminal to catch. The sun continued its downward path over Portland, promising a new day of challenges and, perhaps, victories. The disinformation operation planned by Marcus and Grace began to bear fruit more quickly than they had expected. Through their network of social workers and Patterson's discreet collaboration, they began to spread strategic rumors about a massive expansion of the elderly protection program. The suspicious letter carrier, identified as Frank Dawson, took the bait. Patterson caught him taking photos of a fake list of new program participants that Grace had deliberately left visible in a community center. He passed the information on, said Marcus, looking at the security camera footage in his new center of operations, a room at the back of an abandoned church that Grace occasionally used for volunteer work. 3 different men have approached him in the last 48 hours. Grace leaned over the monitor, studying the faces captured by the camera. The one on the right, I'm pretty sure I saw him near Ms. Thompson's house last week. They're getting careless, Marcus observed. Fear is making them make mistakes. Or, Grace pondered, that's exactly what Crane wants us to think. Marcus turned to face her, noticing the concern in her green eyes. Over the last few weeks, he had learned to trust her instincts as much as his own. What are you thinking? It's all too easy, she replied, starting to pace around the room. Crane is known for his caution and meticulous planning. Why would his men suddenly be so careless? Before Marcus could answer, his phone vibrated. A message from Diana. Weapon? Crane knows about the church. Get out of there. The sound of screeching tires outside confirmed the warning. Marcus grabbed his laptop as Grace quickly deleted the physical files into a metal garbage can. Back exit, he whispered, guiding her through the dark church corridor. Years of police training had made him memorize all the escape routes as soon as they had chosen the location. They made it to the back alley just before they heard the front door of the church being kicked in. Grace stumbled slightly, and Marcus grabbed her, pulling her behind a dumpster as headlights illuminated the entrance to the alley. Marcus's heart was pounding, not just from the adrenaline of the escape, but from the closeness of Grace. She was pressed against his chest, and he could feel her breathing quicken. Marcus, she whispered, so close that he could feel her warm breath on his neck. If something happens, it won't, he interrupted firmly, although his heart protested against the lie. The headlights approached, and Marcus calculated his options. The alley had 2 exits, the main one, now blocked by the car, and a narrow passage between 2 buildings that led to a parallel street. When I say now, he muttered, run through the passage. Don't look back. Don't stop. I'll meet you at point C. I'm not leaving you, Grace protested, grabbing his arm. Grace, he said, finally allowing all the emotion contained in the last few weeks to show in his voice. I need you to be safe, please. Something in his tone must have convinced her, because Grace nodded reluctantly. Marcus waited until the car had come to a complete stop, hearing doors opening. Now, he whispered urgently. Grace ran silently towards the passageway while Marcus moved in the opposite direction, purposely making noise to attract the pursuer's attention. There, shouted a voice, and Marcus heard heavy footsteps approaching. He ran, aware that every second of pursuit was more time for Grace to escape. He knew the area well. He had studied maps and done extensive reconnaissance over the previous weeks. After a few minutes of chasing, Marcus managed to lose his pursuers using a series of interconnected alleyways. When he was finally sure he was alone, he allowed himself a moment to catch his breath, leaning against a damp wall. His phone vibrated. A message from Grace. Secure. Point C compromised. Alternative D. Marcus smiled despite the situation. Grace was always one step ahead. Point D was a secure apartment that she had prepared without him knowing, just in case, as she would say. It took him almost 2 hours to get there, taking a purposely erratic route to make sure he wasn't being followed. When he finally entered the small apartment on the 3rd floor of an old building, he found Grace organizing documents on a new makeshift wall. Are you okay? They both asked simultaneously, and then smiled, the tension dissipating a little. "Crane knew," said Grace, turning her attention back to the documents. "He let us follow those leads, made us think we were in control. To trap us," added Marcus. "But why didn't he catch us?" "Because that wasn't the point," Grace replied, her eyes shining with sudden understanding. "He wanted to force us to show our hand, reveal our resources, our allies. And now he knows exactly what he's fighting," Marcus concluded, the gravity of the situation weighing on them. Grace approached him, her green eyes intense. "But he's also revealed something about himself. Those men in the alley, they weren't professionals. They were amateurs, probably hired locally." Marcus began to understand, "which means that Crane's real operators, they're somewhere else," Grace added. "Probably preparing for something bigger." They looked at each other, the same realization hitting them both simultaneously. The chase wasn't the real attack. It was just a distraction. "The elderly," said Marcus, already reaching for his phone. "We need to check all of them. Now." It was going to be a long night, but for the first time since they'd started this investigation, they had something Crane hadn't expected, a true understanding of their game. And with that understanding came a chance, perhaps the only chance they would ever have, to turn him against himself. The early morning in the secure apartment was one of intense activity. Marcus and Grace coordinated a thorough check of all the elderly people in their safety net, discreetly mobilizing social workers and Patterson's trusted police officers. "Everyone is safe," said Grace, collapsing into a chair after the last confirmation. "But we found evidence of attempted break-ins at 3 residences." Marcus was studying a digital map on his laptop screen. "They weren't real attempts," he concluded. "They were tests, checking our responses, our reaction time. To plan something bigger," Grace added, her green eyes reflecting the light from the screen. "But what?" The answer came via an urgent message from Diana. "Social Welfare Center. Files. Now." Marcus and Grace exchanged alarmed glances. The Portland Welfare Center kept detailed records of all the elderly people in the region, addresses, health conditions, financial situation. It was a goldmine for someone like Crane. "It's a cleanup operation," said Marcus, reaching for his holster. "He's going to try to erase all records that could connect him to the crimes. And steal information for new targets," added Grace, quickly gathering equipment. "Marcus, those files, there are thousands of vulnerable, elderly people registered there." They didn't need to say any more. Within minutes, they were in Marcus' car, driving through the still dark streets of Portland. Grace made discreet calls, alerting Patterson and a small, trusted team to position themselves strategically around the center. "We can't get too many people involved," Marcus warned. "We still don't know how far Crane's infiltration of the department goes." They arrived at the center 20 minutes later. The 3-story building was apparently quiet, but Marcus noticed subtle details. A slightly misaligned security camera, fresh tire marks on the wet asphalt. "They're already here," Grace whispered. Marcus nodded, checking his gun. "Grace, you know this building better than anyone. What's the best way to get in without being seen?" "There's a maintenance entrance at the back," she replied. "It leads directly to the basement, where the oldest archives are. From there, we can access the internal system." They followed the side alley, keeping to the shadows. Grace entered a code on an inconspicuous panel, and a service door opened silently. The basement was dark and cold, full of files on metal shelves. Marcus could hear movement upstairs, heavy footsteps, muffled voices. 3, maybe 4 men, he whispered. Grace guided them through the maze of files to a hidden workstation. "I can access the system from here," she said, her fingers already flying over the keyboard. "But I need time." "How much?" 10 minutes to copy everything to a secure server. Another 5 to implement the protection protocol. Marcus checked his watch. For 17 in the morning. Soon the day would begin to dawn. "Do what you need to do. I'll check the perimeter." Before he could move away, Grace grabbed his arm. "Marcus," she said, her voice heavy with emotion. "Be careful." He covered her hand with his, allowing himself a moment of vulnerability. "I always am." Marcus moved silently through the basement, keeping in radio contact with Patterson outside. The sounds above continued, drawers being opened, papers being rummaged through. Suddenly, he heard a different sound. Footsteps on the stairs leading down to the basement. He quickly retreated to Grace's position. "Company coming," he whispered. "How much longer?" "3 minutes," she replied, without taking her eyes off the screen. "The protection protocol is already active." Footsteps approached. Marcus positioned himself strategically, using the bookshelves as cover. He could see 2 shadows moving down the main corridor. "There must be something else down here," said a deep voice. "The boss said the most important files would be in the basement." "Look for anything related to the last 5 years," replied another voice. "Especially financial records." Marcus looked at Grace, who nodded silently. The transfer was complete. Now they needed to get out of there undetected. But then something unexpected happened. A phone rang, not theirs, but one of the men in the corridor. "Yes, boss," said the first voice. There was a pause. "Got it?" "No, we haven't found—" "Wait, there's someone." The beam of a flashlight cut through the darkness, almost revealing their position. Marcus acted instinctively, pushing Grace behind a bookcase just as gunshots echoed through the basement. "Police!" he shouted, returning fire from his position. "Drop your weapons." Chaos ensued. More shots were exchanged. Bookshelves were knocked over. Papers flew everywhere. Marcus kept moving, protecting Grace's position while she completed the security protocol. "Ready," she finally shouted. At that moment, the basement lights suddenly came on. Patterson and his team had entered from the other side, surprising the invaders. On the floor, "Now," ordered Patterson. The 2 men, cornered, had no choice but to surrender. When the handcuffs were put on, Marcus could finally breathe a sigh of relief. "The files?" he asked Grace. "Safe," she replied with a tired smile. "And even better, I managed to trace the origin of the orders. We have a location for Crane." The next few hours were a whirlwind of activity. Special teams were mobilized, warrants were issued, and a coordinated operation was mounted in record time. Crane was found in a country house on the outskirts of the city, apparently preparing to flee. The arrest was anticlimactic. He surrendered without resistance, as if he had expected this moment. Later, sitting in a coffee shop near the police station, Marcus and Grace finally had a moment to process everything that had happened. "It's over," Grace said softly, her fingers playing with the coffee cup. "Not completely," replied Marcus. "There's still a lot of work ahead of us. Lawsuits, depositions, recovering evidence." "And then what?" she asked, her eyes meeting his with an intensity that made his heart race. Marcus reached across the table, interlacing his fingers with hers. Well, I think we need to talk about some things that aren't related to the case." Grace smiled, that smile that had captured his heart from day one. "I can't wait." The sun was rising over Portland, marking the end of one case and the beginning of something new. Marcus looked at their joined hands on the cafeteria table and knew, with absolute certainty, that some partnerships were destined to last far beyond the last page of a police report.